We are a data infrastructure layer for more deterministic and accurate RAG systems. And so developers use us to help create knowledge graphs of their data, push it to production faster.
What is knowledge graph?
Something can be semantically similar without being relevant, and something can be relevant without being semantically similar. We currently offer a Python SDK to streamline knowledge graph creation.
I can actually build knowledge graphs for each disease condition, so to speak, right? Or each procedure or each diagnosis.
Graph reasoning versus graph retrieval. Do you want to touch upon that? So today is our 17th episode of Generative AI in Enterprise. Chia, I got started with this meetup group back in December. I was working on some generative AI projects, etc., conversational AI. Then I wanted to see, explore what is going on outside in the world, what are other people working on. That's how I got started with this group. And fortunately, I met so many different people, including you. And so I am Ujjwal Bhattacharjee. I work in the financial industry. I have been in the industry for almost 20 years, based out of New Jersey. And that's pretty much it from my side. This whole meetup group is completely my own initiative. Any positions or strategies or opinions of my employer is not reflected over here. It's all my own. And we are recording this session. We are going to photograph recording and put it in social media. So if anyone in this group has any concerns, let me know. And also, if there are any IPs or any confidential information that you do not want to share, please do not, right? Because we are going to put it in the social media. At this point of time, we want to get introduced to Chia. So the way I saw you is of course, through our LinkedIn. Someone shared WHYHOW.AI, and then I started following you. We have been connecting. We have been talking for the last 6 months, I think, back in December or January. And then we lost touch. And then once again, we saw that there is a new update to your whole platform. So we want to let you kind of introduce yourself. Who are you? I know you have been part of a lot of different initiatives. You have been part of Cambridge, Harvard, as well as you have been under Forbes 30 and 30. But I'll let you kind of tell the story behind how you got started, where you come from, etc. So over to you, Chia.
Sure. Yeah, happy to have a conversation. Nice to meet everyone. My name is Chia. I'm one of the co-founders of WHYHOW.AI, and we are a data infrastructure layer for more deterministic and accurate RAG systems. And so developers use us to help create knowledge graphs of their data. And we specialize in small knowledge graph construction as opposed to very traditional large graph construction. And my background's a little bit all over the place, but was previously a founder, previously an operator, previously an investor in a range of different industries across SaaS, fintech, and a little bit in the legal space. And yeah, excited to be here.
Awesome. How did that name came about? WHYHOW.AI?
Yeah, for sure. So we came across the problem space of knowledge graphs and RAG really because we were trying to build RAG systems ourselves last year and ran into a whole bunch of issues with the limitations of semantic similarity and the kind of need for kind of very precise context injection memory and such and such and such. And so the way that we thought about it was that, there is the 6-7 things that you care about, who, what, when, where, why, how, and that, who, what, when, where were really straightforward data retrieval problems, but why and how of that equation was, something a little bit more complex, something that required a little bit more structure when it came to information retrieval processes. And so that was kind of how the company was born.
It's a very, very interesting name. Whenever I saw that WHYHOW.AI. Okay, so that's good. That's good. So basically, you mentioned WHYHOW.AI, right? It's you're building RAG and knowledge bed. What is the journey that you're looking forward to in the future, right? Where is it going?
Sure. So what we want to do is really help provide RAG systems and push it to production faster. And we think that structured knowledge representation via knowledge graphs is one of the main ways to get there. And this comes as a reflection of both our personal experience kind of building systems, our previous expertise with graph systems, and also reflection of, I think the market has also started to recognize that knowledge graph structures are going to be more and more relevant in the AI space because it presents a level of structure that other systems are less able to provide. And so, been also recognized by Gartner fairly recently as being one of the most impactful technologies in the Gen AI space. So I think it's been kind of a really, really interesting space to be. But to answer your question, fundamentally what we want to do is really be able to help provide more accurate, more deterministic systems to production faster. That's very much our North goal. And we think that graph structures are going to be what we are going to rely on to inject context and to get smarter systems.
So we know a vector database, right? So if I have a set of data or some documents, suppose in a S3 bucket, and then I want to search on that document. So first I need to do some embedding and I put it in a vector database, and then I go ahead and use RAG architecture to search, retrieve, and then send it to LLM to generate some recommendations or answers from the LLM. What is knowledge graph? What does it helps us to do, like beyond the vector database?
Sure. So there are fundamental limitations to semantic similarity because as the LLM retrieves information from a vector database, it's fundamentally doing so on the basis of semantic similarity. And so imagine, we can imagine that semantic similarity and relevancy are two different things. And something can be semantically similar without being relevant, and something can be relevant without being semantically similar. And so as a result, being able to make sure that you have the ability to inject your own context and structure the relationships and entities that best reflect reality, best reflect your specific context, are something that is really important. And so that's what we've been seeing quite consistently based on our personal experience, based on the experiences of quite a lot of our design partners out there who want the same thing. And that's what we're focusing on, and focusing very much within that space on small knowledge graphs as the primary way to get that level of determinism and accuracy.
So are you saying that is it like a either or, like whether if I use a vector database versus a knowledge graph, is it like either or? I mean, either I use a vector or a knowledge graph, or I use a combination of those two?
Yeah, exactly. We prefer to advocate for a hybrid search approach. So we think there's a lot of power with vector search. We think there's a lot of power with graph search. In fact, a lot of our kind of designs and architectures with our design partners is really using graph structures as a semantic map to understand which vector chunks you should be extracting and putting in the context window. And so you can see graph structures really being used to augment vector search.
Graph structured using augment vector search. Okay. So one more thing, Chia, it kind of like, I found it very interesting that in your website, it says deterministic approach, right? Typically, we all know, like whenever it comes to large language models, and typically in AI, everything is like probabilistic, right? So how does this deterministic and the probabilistic kind of go together, and how is knowledge graph based search makes it deterministic versus like non-deterministic approach?
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, again, vector search, the way that it works is it's very much on the basis of semantic similarity, and semantic similarity is probabilistic. And so being able to enforce that certain relationships exist through a knowledge graph structure is then something that becomes a lot more reliable. And so there's a very neat interplay at the moment where LLMs can be augmented with knowledge graphs, but knowledge graphs themselves can also be created or assisted through the creation process by LLMs themselves. And so there's a very neat flywheel there that exists to be taken advantage of. And folks like ourselves are building tooling to really be able to tackle this and kick that flywheel off.
I have a question over here from Vivek. There are several companies, including AWS and likes, that talk about RAG as a step in the process of building AI-based applications. How is your company doing different?
Sure. So yeah, we're certainly infrastructure for RAG, and we're a very specific piece of the RAG infra. So Obviously, there are vector databases out there, LM orchestration tools, your prompt engineering tools, etc. And we want to be able to own the entire ecosystem and tooling layer for graph creation specifically as a piece of that stack.
Sounds good. Sounds good. So now, so basically, of course, like we started off with a quick introduction. We talked about, we kind of like jumped directly into the topic, right? And I just wanted to make sure, Chia, do you have any presentation or anything, or we are good with this casual like conversation back and forth? Just making sure, like, what is the format that you are looking forward to? You're good with this format, or do you have anything to share?
I'm happy to have a conversation.
Okay, good. I just wanted to make sure. Okay, so now we talked about a little bit about like the knowledge graphs. We talked about vector database. So I want to jump into a little bit more details and deep dive into WhyHow and like what is WhyHow and what are the key products and services that WhyHow offers at this point of time. And of course, like you might also have a roadmap in the future to extend it, make it bigger. So if you can just touch upon real quick, like the key products and services of WhyHow.
Sure. So we currently offer a Python SDK to streamline knowledge graph creation. And a key focus for us really is two things, which is more granular control over the graphs that you are creating. And so we allow you to run a bunch of rules, set and develop your own schema for the graph itself. And we see this as part of the new next generation of what we call ECL tooling, where you're looking to really introduce semantics into the system and being able to turn traditional ETL processes into what we call ECL, which is extract, contextualize, and load data accordingly. And so within this more kind of granular tooling for graph creation, we also think about building systems for the creation of small graphs, which is very scoped in representations of data that are far more manageable, far easier to orchestrate across a RAG pipeline, and solutions to facilitate the orchestration of kind of these small packets of structured knowledge.
Very interesting. ECL. This is the first time I'm hearing this one. So definitely some Google search needs to be done. There is another question over here from Vivek. The purpose of RAG is to augment the prompt that is used to query LLM. And the trick seems to be in how the chunking is performed and how the semantic or hybrid search is used to find the most relevant embeddings for enriching the prompt. Do you have any recommendations that help improve the accuracy of the prompt or the performance?
Sure. So yeah, LMs and semantic similarity are obviously very powerful tools, but what we found is that it's still not sufficient for a lot of enterprise workflows. And so being able to impose knowledge graphs, and which is a very structured way of retrieval, becomes something that people want to be able to do to fulfill a lot of kind of last mile accuracy issues, which semantic similarity is just structurally unable to pick up.
Cool. So the next question that I have, you mentioned SDK, and also I saw in your website and the blog post, right? So it's a open source. So how does this open source thing work for you? And like, what are the boundaries? Like, what is your organization where you have these IPs and you're going to make money? And then the other thing is the open source. Like, so how is this platform laid out? Is it just the SDK or more than that?
Sure. We open source a few things, few packages that revolve around how do you best extract information out of graphs themselves after the graph has been created. And so that's some of the things that we've done. We currently have a closed source graph creation SDK, as mentioned. And so that's, I think, where we're currently focused our attentions to in the short term, as people are running into I'd say a lot of difficulties with trying to streamline graph creation, and we want to be there to be able to help them structure their data much more quickly and with the exact opinions that they have, so that they can best represent the data in a way that fits their use case.
What is a graph? knowledge graph, and why would someone use it?
Sure. So a knowledge graph is conceptually quite straightforward. Consists of just nodes and edges, and the nodes and edges represent the entities and the relationships captured in a straightforward way. And so when you have that relationship and entities kind of mapped out neatly, the retrieval process becomes a little bit more straightforward process, because you're then injecting your opinion, injecting your view of the things that are related and how they're related, and being able to retrieve information based on that semantic map itself, as opposed to simply just relying on semantic similarity.
I'm learning this area, and specifically my background is in healthcare, and we have been looking to we have identified opportunities where we could use the generative AI to improve some of our workflows. And we were looking at all these different techniques, right? And to begin with, I think RAG's probably the best way for us to go, using an enterprise license for a specific LLM, before we go into any fine tuning or train a model by itself, right? So I know from what I understand, right, is from a RAG perspective, if you look at, Pinecone or any of these vector databases, that essentially help take that, chunk it into the, and I think we're still trying to figure out, how to chunk the documents that we have. But once it is there and you're doing the semantic search or hybrid search using metadata, you're essentially trying to find, the closest probabilistic matches, right? That you can, or the most recent matches, so to speak, that you can then enrich enrich your prompt and send it in, right? So knowledge graphs, right? Like, as you described it, right? So that's how I understand the knowledge graphs. It's the entities that are related to each other, the relationship is defined, between those. How is that different? Because when you're building the knowledge graph, right, isn't the knowledge graph also being built using that probabilistic relationship between the two?
For sure. So the great thing about knowledge graph is if you think about how the retrieval process works within vector retrieval, it gets returned to the LLM, and the LLM constructs the answer for you, and that's the end of the process. You move on to the next question. Now, imagine if you are now constructing a knowledge graph, and yes, you may do it. You don't necessarily have to do it in the way that you describe, but let's say we do. The information can then be saved into the graph in a structured way, and you can then perform further retrieval against the knowledge base to then say, okay, A is related to B. I've captured this knowledge and it's put into the graph. I have now also understood that C is related to D somewhere else in the passage, and I put that into the knowledge graph. And then further on in the knowledge base, maybe like page 500 of the knowledge base, it becomes then someone then mentions, oh, B is related to C. And so then being able to understand and can map all of this information out within the knowledge graph, which you then query against, helps you understand that, oh, it turns out A and D are actually related to each other. And when I want to retrieve the answer and put it, return it to the context window and then provide the full answer, it has the context that all of these things are fundamentally related. And so it's these types of relationships, for example, that are helpful. Also helpful in the sense that it may not be clear to the LLM that these relationships even exist in the first place. And a human might be necessary to establish those relationships, or a semantic map is necessary to be able to retrieve that information. So, for example, thinking through things like document hierarchies and the graph structures that relate to document hierarchies is one example of the way that you want some kind of semantic structure to augment your vector retrieval.
Is this a way of really addressing the gap of the LLM's inability to retain the context beyond a certain number of iterations or back and forth, right? Is that a way to really solve for that? And the second question, right, and I'll shut up after that. So this is really the way I was imagining the workflow, right? So essentially the knowledge graph is being generated using the results, right, to create all those nodes and the relationship. So you have that ongoing context for that conversation, right, between whether you use a chatbot or an application or whatever, it doesn't matter, right? It's the ongoing context that it is retaining. And once that session is over, the knowledge graph goes away and you basically, start again, right, with the new query. So is that the right way of thinking about it?
That's one way you could use it. You could also imagine the scenario where the knowledge graph is permanent. So, for example, you could imagine that there's unstructured text and unstructured conversation that's going on, and you want to be able to say, okay, as an enterprise workflow, I care about these three things within the conversation itself. So you can imagine that maybe it's a financial analyst reporting system, and you care about these three financial numbers. And at the end of the day, what you want from the unstructured text is to make sure that there's a graph and there's memory saved about these three specific metrics, and being able to then turn that unstructured conversation into a report. Based on, these are the three things I want to capture. These are the three things I want to use my knowledge graph for. And then kind of setting that schema and making sure that it's constantly kind of retrieving the information and only the information that you want. So yes. And so one way to look at it also, besides just, establishing relationships so that you can then more deterministically do retrieval, it's also about, using the graph itself as a lens for semantic focus, right? So to your point, yes, in theory, the LM can potentially keep track of everything across millions and millions of documents. In practice, I think that's probably not true. And so being able to use the graph as these are the three things I care about across 100 documents, and being able to make sure that the extraction process can be seen and preserved across conversations, preserved across workflows and sessions. Yes, I think that's another use case for it.
The very specific use case or the area that I'm thinking about is really in the healthcare arena, right? So, for example, right, when you go to a doctor, in certain cases, right, the doctor might actually say that, hey, you need to get this procedure done. And then in order to get the procedure done, you usually may require a prior authorization from your, insurance company. What they really do is they look at, all of the documentation about your, the information that the doc is presenting, and, making an assessment whether based on the procedure code, diagnosis codes, the history and the corpus of knowledge that they have from various sources, from academia as well as the field, making a determination whether this procedure is the appropriate procedure to perform at this point in time. Should it be approved or denied, right? So in that context, right, keeping that in mind, so if you're trying to build knowledge graphs, right, so to speak, in this case, or we're trying to build an LLM based system. So what you're saying is really that I can actually build knowledge graphs for each, in concept, right, each disease condition, so to speak, right, or each procedure or each diagnosis. Continue to reference this so that I don't have to go back to the LLM every time to be to find out, right, a summarization, because I've already had this knowledge graph built for each of them, and continue to store them, right, on a longer term basis, so to speak. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think you phrased this perfectly well. And that's actually one, that specific use case, not in the prior auth space, but that specific use case of being able to freeze a set of diagnoses, freeze a set of procedures, or basically freeze the thing that you want in the document that you can then refer to, is precisely, we have a lot of healthcare design partners, and they're doing very similar things, not in the prior auth space, but in other spaces. And so, yeah.
So then how will the pipeline look like? So for example, I have these documents stored in somewhere, and then I still go ahead and do the embedding, still store it in the vector database. And then I query those vector databases, get the results out. So I'm doing still the RAG thing, right? Eventually the responses, I say good, bad, ugly, whatever it is, and then goes back into the memory, which is the knowledge graph. Is that correct? Is that the flow that we're looking at?
Yeah, so Deshaun says yes, it can be. I think the important bit to note here is that structured knowledge RAG is a process and not a system. And what this means is that it very much depends on the types of questions. The way I like to think about RAG is each question that you ask is a separate workflow. And what I mean by that is, you could be asking about what are the directions to the hospital versus what is my leave policy for today. And each of these would have to be, the systems to answer these will be constructed potentially different ways, depending on how the data is stored, depending on a whole bunch of different factors. And so what we've discovered, and our strong opinion, is that the way being able to structure information and then apply it depends very much on what your existing process and architecture looks like, how exactly you're trying to answer these questions, what does the data look like, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But there's fundamental value in being able to structure information and being able to structure very scoped in representations of information as opposed to trying to structure and capture everything into a large knowledge graph. And so the way that we've identified, we've come up with 9 different ways that you would want to structure data for very different use cases, and you would orchestrate it across the different spectrum. So there's no kind of like one size fit all architecture, because it very much does depend on kind of what you're doing for. And our goal is to be able to provide tooling for developers and also domain experts to be able to identify what kinds of data structures they'd like to have captured in the knowledge graph for different use cases, and then being able to orchestrate that across the entire kind of RAG pipeline. And so ultimately what we're serving up here is really structure, determinism across the pipeline, if that makes sense.
I'm just trying to think it out in my mind right now. But are you seeing that structure, creation of that structure and that creation of the small knowledge graph, that is a completely separate process altogether? So we build that and then we help make use of that to get answers. Is that the correct way of looking at it? So there is a completely independent process of building that structured representation.
Yes, in the sense that structure, you can represent anything in the knowledge graph. And so the question is less about can you represent information in knowledge graph, and the question is more about like, well, what data do I want to represent and for what purpose? And in our experience, like it's not actually physically possible and also too unwieldy to try to represent every single relationship and every single entity and every single concept within the graph itself. So what you want to do is you want to be very scoped in and say, this is the specific problem I have with my RAG system. This is what I want to represent in a structured way so that it augments my RAG system. And I'm doing that for this particular purpose. And if I'm doing something else and structuring a different type of knowledge in a different type of way for a different type of purpose, you can also use similar tools to be able to do that. And so ultimately, you know, at the end of the day, this is tools for structuring data. But there's no such thing as, you know, only one type of data to structure or only one way to structure data, right? Like structuring data can be done in a whole bunch of different ways. And so we want structuring data to accommodate for that for very specific problems that we've observed within RAG.
So it's like not, as you mentioned, like from the very beginning, it's augmenting. It's not like we do this in sequence. It's like 2 different things, combine those together to get the best possible answer. Not like only do RAG or not like only do knowledge-based search, right? Knowledge graph-based search. Okay.
Yeah, for sure.
So in some of your documentation, I think I saw graph reasoning versus graph retrieval. Do you want to touch upon that, those 2 areas?
Yeah, for sure. So the way that we think about it is that depending on the type of information that you've been able to preserve and represent within the graph structure, there could be, you know, the ability to directly just retrieve information from a graph itself, but there's also the potential to be able to represent, you know, a sequence of logical steps that need to be undertaken or need to be considered within a graph structure. And so this is almost like a tree of thought type model, where you're representing, you know, reasoning processes within a graph or tree structure, so that you are then able to make sure that the way that the question is processed is done in the correct way. And so we see a lot of really interesting things with the fact that you could represent 2 very different things within a graph structure, which is the underlying information itself, as well as the reasoning process of which you would use as you consider the information.
Almost similar to like chain of thought in the RAG-based architecture, right? So basically then, okay, I'll move on to some of the questions that I have. One of them, you just mentioned about automated schema or schema controlled automated knowledge graphs. What is that?
Sure. So that is really tooling to allow the user and the developer to be able to inject the specific things that they care about and specific things that they want to structure. So, as mentioned, I think there was a previous conversation about how to extract, for example, procedures or medication or, prior history. And you could imagine that, part of the workflow involves processing medical files and patient files. And so then being able to say, okay, I only care about 4 things, and the 4 things I care about that I want to extract and preserve and kind of keep within a specific semantic map is like blood type, name, date of birth, etc., being able to then say, okay, the schema of the graph I want is not everything within the patient report, but it's actually only these 4 things. And then this is the schema that I then use to then put the information within the graph itself and preserve that. And you could imagine that that same schema would be used across hundreds and thousands of different patient medical records because that's the specific thing that you simply care about, so that when you do future retrieval, such as being able to compare a patient file to maybe the surgery being authorized, you can say, okay, these are the things I want to compare, these are the things I want to extract. It's really kind of well preserved within the knowledge graph, as opposed to, having to do a vector search and potentially getting the answer or potentially not getting the answer.
Okay, makes sense. It's a very interesting thing. I found it interesting. I have not worked on knowledge graph, so that's a good learning experience as well for me as well. So I think that kind of like covers the high level aspect. Now let's come to the platform, like the WHYHOW.AI platform. So if someone wants to get started, is it like a SaaS platform that we do a subscription? Like, how does it work?
Yeah.
Is there like a UI where I drag and drop and create data pipelines?
Yeah, we're still fairly early. So we're early stage venture back company. And so we're about 3 weeks into our beta at the moment. And so it is currently served up as a SDK. And so if folks are interested in joining the beta, they'd have to reach out to us for API keys, as it's a closed beta that we're working on at the moment. But eventually, over time, absolutely being able to have more generally accessible SaaS and API product is how we think about it.
Oh, so right now it's just only the SDK part. Okay, so that's good. I mean, of course, like it's going to grow super fast. I know that. Tell me a little bit more about like what do you see in the future? Everywhere people are talking about RAG and this knowledge search. So where do you see the future very soon? And also now multimodal coming into picture. And also there is the hardest problem that I saw. I do not know whether it has been solved or not, is like complex documents with pictures in it, with tables in it, and not only just a regular, text. So it makes it like even more complex in a document search. So where do you see that kind of like shaping up in the near future, like maybe 6 months to 1 year?
Sure. Yeah, we don't focus on data extraction ourselves, even though we see ourselves as a workflow tool, but certainly agree with a lot of your comments that data extraction is still certainly a huge problem. And we will hopefully see more and more improvements around data extraction. And so very much looking forward to better data extraction models coming up. And I think there's a bunch of people out there doing some pretty good work. And yeah, I think we're very excited about the future of RAG. Our view of why RAG is, even though it's a huge market, it's the second biggest use case after code generation, the reason why we think it's going to be extremely exciting moving forward is really because we have a view that most white-collar workflows are some form of information retrieval. And in the sense that most white-collar jobs is really taking information, doing some basic reasoning on it, and then returning it back in a structured format. And so we see that RAG really encompasses the vast majority of the white-collar workflow market, if that makes sense. And so that's what I think is very interesting to us about RAG.
Yeah. So basically now I'm getting the picture over here. So your focus is not on the extraction part, but rather if the data is extracted, how can I position it better, or how can I make it searchable better and make it deterministic? Okay, so now I think I'm getting a little bit of clarity on the architecture. Definitely it needs a little bit more deep dive. I'm very new to this knowledge graph. Okay, so one more question that I have is a little bit common across like platforms, and it's a very common question. I'm pretty sure everyone has asked you. So if you're building a SaaS platform, how are you envisioning that data privacy and compliance requirements will be handled within your platform? Because anyway, like you're building the knowledge graph, you're expecting the knowledge graph to be sitting in your SaaS platform, right? So how are you going to communicate with the enterprise? Are you thinking about like integrate with AWS ecosystems within the VPC or something like that? Or like, what is your vision? Or is it just an API call that we make to your SaaS platform?
No, absolutely. I think that's a great question. Data privacy is certainly something that we think about a lot, and the short answer is yes to all of the above. Being able to integrate with existing ecosystems and playing nice with all of that. We are also vector and database agnostic. We encourage anyone who wants to bring their own API keys for their favorite vector database, and we'll be rolling out support for the most popular ones over time. And so the way that we think about it is really a data orchestration platform. The data can lie anywhere they want. And one of my co-founders built a number of dev platforms, and he's very focused on security, especially from a platform perspective. And so that's something that is in our DNA from day one.
So you mentioned like agnostic of vector databases, right? So similarly, I'm trying to put the architecture in my mind, like. So I'm more familiar with the RAG architecture, and I'm more like worked a lot with the LLMs and all, but I'm trying to put your piece in my mind. So basically, where does LLMs fit into your architecture space? If I'm building an architecture, is LLM part of your WHYHOW? I don't think so, right? You're the knowledge graph company, and we use you as the knowledge graph, but then we use our own LLM to kind of like get a summarized answer out of the knowledge graph. Is that a correct understanding, Chia?
No, not precisely. We do use LLMs within our workflows to help with the knowledge graph generation. And again, we want to be a workflow platform. So if somebody wants to bring their own LLM for whatever reason, or prefers to use certain types of LLMs for whatever reason to help with the graph creation process, we certainly can accommodate that over time as we adopt more and more kind of solutions.
Okay. Yep. Now it's more making sense. I mean, the more I talk, more making sense. So thanks for being patient and answering those dumb questions. But really I'm enjoying this conversation. Good. So I can bring my own vector database, I can bring my own LLM, or I can use the LLMs within your organization that but you're typically using the LLMs in order to create that knowledge graph. And once the knowledge graph is created, now it becomes very easy for me to get a deterministic answer. So is there any evaluation process that you do when you create the knowledge graph? Like, so for example, if I'm using the LLM to create the knowledge graph, someone has to say whether this knowledge graph that is being created is good or bad. So how do you evaluate that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the way that we think about evaluations is very much that, a lot of our design partners that work with us have a good understanding of why they want graph structures and where semantic similarity fails. And so we help kind of with the identification of the right type of graph structures that they want. And we've done a lot of content around the different types of graph structures that one would need for different use cases. So we have, very different workflows for very different types of graphs that one would create. And we are very much focused on that. And so they have a good understanding of, this is where semantic similarity fails, and therefore these graph structures will help be able to increase the accuracy in specific ways. That being said, we also are in the process of rolling out a bunch of kind of benchmarks and recipe books and cookbooks to show kind of some of the differences between retrieval from a graph versus retrieval from a vector search, and some of the nuances there.
Very good. So do you envision that there will be, like, of course, like human involvement for the evaluation process also, right? So do you think that in your tool you're going to give access to admins or like whoever, whatever the role is, they can go ahead and evaluate some of the questions based on, I don't know, like how it's going to work out, but just wonder like how will that human in the loop kind of like concept work out in your vision?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a good question. So we do believe that while our tools are some of the best in the market to help create and streamline the creation of knowledge graphs, there is always, going to be missing context. And so being able to incorporate human in the loops workflows specifically around like domain experts, some of them who are non-technical, to be able to inject the context, be able to inject the specific types of structured relationships that exist is going to be more and more important over time. So certainly that's something that we think will be a part of the process. And we want to really be able to automate as much as possible. And so kind of make sure that the human intervention is less and less necessary over time, but certainly we think that that's still going to be a component of the system and workflows.
I think now I have a picture painted in my mind. I do not know whether that is accurate to your vision or not. Maybe I have to see your architecture diagram to dive deep, but at least now I have a nice picture. So typically we have been talking about like RAG and retrieval augmented generation, embed and put it in the vector store and then search. And then the biggest challenge that we have is evaluation, right? Whether the answer that is coming out, I mean, we all know that it's probabilistic. So people are not confident enough. So you're trying to solve that problem. Correct me if I go wrong, but I think you're trying to solve that problem, right? People are not confident. So basically, like in industries where it's highly regulated, you have to have a correct answer or you cannot put it in production. So you're targeting that. You're giving another option to the community saying that, hey, RAG might be a good solution using vector stores, but there is another way of doing it. Using the help of LLMs, you can build a knowledge graph, and then you can search from the knowledge graph, and then you are not constantly going back to the LLM. You also reduce your cost. You have a deterministic way of, getting your answers back. And then in the future, you're also thinking about like putting a evaluation metrics and criteria and ways to fix the knowledge graph over a period of time. Because once the knowledge graph is set, I mean, like pretty much it can be used. One more question that comes to my mind is like, suppose I'm building a knowledge graph on a disease, right? As Vivek was saying. Now, the knowledge graph, the content of the knowledge graph might go outdated, or there can be additional new content that is coming in. So always there is a thing about like, okay, I need to strip out this is not making more sense anymore, or I have to add more stuff. So how do you do that delta part? That makes it very interesting.
Yeah, no, that's actually a very, I appreciate that question because I think that's a very low level question, which, A, tells me that you have a really good picture in your head. B, tells me that I need to work on explaining it because it took me a bit too long to explain it. So I really appreciate that that question for sure. So yeah, I think it's a fascinating question. It's something that we are working on. There's certainly things that you could do to think about how you can orchestrate freshness of data, track freshness of data. There are a whole bunch of techniques that have historically existed that we're also working to productionize on that, but it does involve being able to create a whole bunch of systems and agents to track the status of the freshness of the information in the data itself, being able to write rules around it, being able to maintain a bunch of consistency in the way that you want your data expressed. And so absolutely. And I think that's kind of part of what we were here for, which is like there is a whole bunch of different nuances that you would have that requires very granular control over how the graph is both created and maintained over time, that requires a whole bunch of tools that to really step in here. And so that's absolutely kind of how we think about what we're doing, because you're right? Like one example, you could imagine a scenario where you would run a rule that says after 30 days, the data should be deleted from the graph, or keep the data forever until like a new piece of data comes in and that overrides it, or keep the old piece of data and then leave the new one in, so we have like a time series of progression, etc., etc. And you can imagine some scenarios where that's important, some scenarios where that's not important, and we want to be able to provide more tooling for developers to be able to express what they want to capture.
So this might be by the way, like you did great in explaining. My mind was like stuck in the RAG world, right? So it took me a time to actually sink in with this concept. So you're great. Okay. But there must be like already, standards and patterns already evolved. But the thing is, like, there must be some established patterns already, like how to maintain that freshness of the data rather than always truncating everything from scratch and then building the knowledge graph from scratch versus just putting that delta out and identifying that delta and then, ability to inject and remove based on certain criteria.
Yeah. So yes and no. I think knowledge graphs has historically been a very niche area to focus on, and it's certainly not popular by a long stretch. And so, most people, I think, as you pointed out, are less familiar with knowledge graphs, right? And so now, given the proliferation of LLMs, semantic meaning and semantic structure now become more important in ways that were less important before. So the technology, honestly, has not. There are still some gaps in the infrastructure for the technology, and so yes, there are some known processes for it, but they are not really production. They're not really popularized or easily accessible. There's a whole bunch of kind of work around time series knowledge graphs as an example that is still very much, I think, in the academic sphere mostly, with kind of obviously there are some productionized versions, but it's still not super popular. It's still not easily accessible as structures to implement. So it's really exciting. I think that we're bringing back a very old piece of technology which have a lot of gaps in just accessibility of the infrastructure. That's what we're here for, really, to help make it easier for the average person to really think about traditional data transformation and orchestration within the context of knowledge graphs.
I think that is beautiful. That is beautiful. Last question that I have is, I'm pretty sure, like, if you're using LLM, you have been using like LangChain or Llama Index, one of the two most popular frameworks, right? LangChain has this thing about like Langgraph that they've released very recently. So is KnowledgeGraph and Langgraph kind of like goes hand in hand? Is that the framework that you use to like, work with your knowledge graph?
Yeah, so I think Langgraph is doing exciting work. We certainly don't conflict with Langgraph. I think the graph structure there that they use is more for agent actions, I believe. And whereas we focus very much on kind of semantic structure. So the difference being, one is more focused around, what do words mean, as opposed to what action should I take. And so this is, I think, a little bit of the difference between kind of the chain of thought process, for example, that I think mirrors it a little bit more, versus kind of this is what words mean, these are how entities are related, and it's just more kind of knowledge, if that makes sense. So one is really more about knowledge and semantics, the other is more about actions and tools and things like that.
I think that's all I have. I really, really enjoyed this session because, to be very honest, I'm not a podcaster, right? I'm a hardcore technical person, and I have never done this podcasting until the last few episodes. And so I was not sure like how to even approach this, session with you. So I had some notes, and I was really struggling to follow the notes initially. Then I just let the notes away, and then I had my own, way of talking with you, so that I can think vision as well as like understand what you're telling. So I think I enjoyed the session really well, and I hope, Vivek, I can see you smiling as well. So Nagarjuna, I hope you enjoyed as well. Nagarjuna, do you have any question? Last 1 minute.
No, I don't have. I'm learning actually.
Yeah.
So
Okay,
I
good.
don't have any other.
So we are all learning together.
Yeah.
And
yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, this was like wonderful. Maybe like I'm pretty sure you will be like super successful with your mission over here. I wish you all the best. I wish to actually connect back with you in maybe 6 months, 1 year down the road to see like how fast or like what is happening new in your world. So looking forward to that.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate you having me on board. It's a privilege to be here, and thanks so much for taking the time.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Chia. Bye.
Take care.